I'm from Philadelphia, but buenos dias. Very happy to be here in Barcelona with my esteemed panelists. And Tim, thank you for the very kind introduction. I will turn it over to each of the panelists to introduce themselves, and maybe we'll start at the far end with Durhane, and then Chris, and then Brian, and then Matt. And then we'll get things going. So please, Durhane.
So thank you very much. I'm really pleased to be here. And Durhane Wong-Rieger. I am President and CEO of the Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders and also serve as Chair for Rare Diseases International, which is the global alliance of patient organizations and other multi-stakeholder groups. I also, by default at the moment, also serving as President of the Asia Pacific Alliance of Rare Disease Organizations. So there's lots of interest globally in terms of this topic.
Great.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Thanks very much for being invited to this conference. I am Christos Sotirelis. I am a patient from the thalassemia community. I'm a patient with thalassemia beta major. And I've been involved over 20 years in patient advocacy. First of all, as a member of the National UK Organization for Thalassemia, and then moving on to doing various missions and writing guidelines and being involved in implementation and awareness and education with the International Federation of Thalassemia. And then for more than 10 years, I've been affiliated also with EURORDIS as I moved into the field of rare diseases and the European policy landscape, and have done a number of projects with them throughout these years. More recently, I've been involved since 2014 as a patient expert at the European Medicines Agency, attending monthly meetings at the Committee for Advanced Therapies. And my special interest, obviously, is ATMPs. And I guess that's probably one of the reasons why I'm here talking to you today and meeting all of you. So I'm looking forward to a very innovative and exciting meeting.
Great. Thanks, Christos. Brian?
Good morning. Brian O'Mahony, Chief Executive of the Irish Haemophilia Society, former President of the World Federation of Haemophilia, and former President of the European Haemophilia Consortium. I'm also a board member of the Irish Blood Transfusion Service. I've been involved with the Haemophilia Society for over 40 years. I have haemophilia B myself. My lived experience with haemophilia goes right from the era of no treatment to plasma to all of the different areas of treatment, right up to and including gene therapy. And I'm currently participating in a gene therapy clinical trial.
Thanks, Brian. And Matt?
So thank you very much for the invitation. I'm Matt Bolz-Johnson. I'm a mental health lead and healthcare advisor at EURORDIS. I've been active at EURORDIS for nearly a decade now, working on the development of European reference networks and patients' involvement in those networks. But I also was one of the researchers active in Rare Impacts, which was a multi-stakeholder initiative EURORDIS led to look at the challenges and solutions of advanced therapies in Europe. So great to be here.
Great. Thanks, Matt. Well, to get things kicked off, the description of our panel is hopes and concerns, and the five of us have met last week, and again, we spent some time yesterday thinking through how best to convey the hopes and the concerns, and also a kind of a third category that we aligned on was how can ARM play a much more significant role in addressing the concerns that the patient communities have. I think those are our key three objectives for this panel, and I guess I'll get things started off with you, Brian. If you could just share your perspective on the hopes of ATMPs and what does it really mean to the hemophilia community and to a patient like yourself to be able to have the benefit of a potential treatment?
I think the hemophilia treatment landscape was the standard treatment for hemophilia were factor concentrates right from the 1970s up to about 2015, 2016, and there wasn't that much innovation. And in the last 6 or 7 years, we've seen an explosion of innovation in hemophilia with new generations of extended half-life factor concentrates, with the first subcutaneous treatment, with several rebalancing agents which are looking at coagulation from a different perspective, and now with licensed gene therapies for both hemophilia A and Haemophilia B. So it's given tremendous hope to the community. It's very exciting. We've been waiting for gene therapy for many, many years and discussing it for many years. Finally, it's here as a licensed option. And I think, of course, it also means that with so many different therapeutic options for haemophilia, there's a real paradox of choice. It means that we must do more on education. People must understand the therapies more. It's no longer a simple decision and choice. But it's a very exciting time, and it's actually a good problem to have, having to deal with more complex educational requirements.
Great. And I guess maybe contrasting the situation with hemophilia, which is a disease with a variety of treatment options, as you described, and maybe a little bit more nuanced decisions by patients and caregivers about what would be the optimal treatment. For other disease states, and maybe a question for you, Durhane, and then Chris, for patients that don't have a standard of care or don't even have a treatment option, how is that kind of sense of hope with the potential for ATMPs to address their disease states? And how does that education need kind of get completely rebalanced?
Why don't you go?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very easy and at the same time difficult decision because, first of all, you have to go beyond the fact that, is it a binary decision to be treated or not to be treated? If there's nothing available, you can't be treated. Of course, when there is availability of gene therapy, potentially curative therapies, then the issue is how do we look at trying to get through the education, first of all, the awareness to the patient, and then also to identify how and what product, if there are choices to be made, like in hemophilia, for instance, and to educate in the pros and cons of different therapies and different risks and different benefits that the patient is likely to consider before making a decision. In my own disease area, it is, I've been involved with this also because of my attendance of the EMA. I've been involved in this, trying to kind of make people aware and raise awareness about the different options. But it's very difficult because you have a very small proportion of patients who are patient experts, who understand, they're interested, they ask questions, they read, and then you have the other patients who are just patients. And for that matter, a lot of them also depends on how stable is their condition and the standard of care that they receive, even though it's palliative mainly. But then if they're happy and they have accommodated to this fact that they will be living their life with this condition, and they can go ahead and have a relatively high quality of life, high normality, then it's a very, very evenly balanced decision to make whether to go for a curative therapy or not.
Durhane?
Yeah, I mean, I think what Chris is saying is certainly applicable across a wide range of diseases. And we deal with, certainly through RDI, deal with patients that are spinal muscular atrophy, patients with retinal, blindness, where there really isn't a viable option. There's some treatments, but none of them are really the kind of major treatments. And then we do have, the thalassemia, sickle cell disease. We have a couple patients now that we know with cystinosis where there actually is a fairly reasonably good therapy, especially the new therapies, but also with Fabry's disease, with MPS, where you can kind of actually have a reasonable quality of life based on the current therapies, but on the other hand, they are onerous therapies, and they're not necessarily complete therapies. I think what we see is that with, for instance, the lysosomal diseases, you can kind of improve quality of life, but you're not going to reduce entirely the risk of a heart attack. With cystinosis, you're not going to necessarily reduce entirely the potential impact in terms of organs. So I think what parents are looking for and what patients are looking for is, can I get much more complete treatment? And we can see that as the possibility with something like a gene therapy. But that's, as Chris is saying, is the more sophisticated patients. And there are patients who are in that kind of a decision-making mode and would like to be able to, move beyond not just the onerousness of the treatments, but also more complete treatment, and even though it's not a cure. So I think those are exciting opportunities. I mean, you balance that, obviously, and I go back to my global perspective, is the hopes of everybody. We did a series of gene therapy sessions through our Rare Disease International community, a year or two ago, and we have a global audience. And the challenge we have for most of that audience is the sense that we're never going to get it. I was telling the story, just recently in a meeting with a couple of very leading patient advocates from Africa, and there was a gene therapy session going on. I said, "Are you going to go and listen to the session?" And they said to me, "We're not going. We're not going to go to these sessions. We're not going to hear any more about gene therapies. We don't want to know because we're never going to get it. There's no use our knowing about it if we're not going to be able to bring it there." And I think that's the tragedy of it. So we're going to talk more about concerns, but everybody's hope is that, can I get access? We're seeing it there, and this is all the, I do the workshops and I'm looking at it, and certainly for most of the low, middle income, direct developing countries, the question is, when do we get it? How do we get it? Can we get into clinical trials? Anybody bring them to us? That's the hope. And obviously, it's not just a question of, can I get standard treatments, which are going to improve my quality of life, versus a gene therapy. We're not getting the standard treatments. And I think the hope for many of us is, I don't know how we do that, and this is maybe going to the end of where Bob wants to go, to what ARM can do or what all of you as companies can do. Can we help leapfrog? It's like the patients and communities tell us, in many of the African communities, Asian communities, people have gone to cellular phones. People have had cellular phones, mobile phones, even before we had them in developed countries, because that was the only means of communications. Can we leapfrog? And somebody says, do we have to give them landlines before we can give them cellular phones? Can we give them advanced therapies without having to go through the current therapies?
Yeah.
That's the challenge. That's the hope. Can we leapfrog there? And I know there's no easy answer to it, but that's the hope that's out there.
Well, thanks for sharing all of that, Durhane. And Matt, I know the daunting challenges of delivering ATMPs and even current standard of care in the less developed world is something that I think the whole world needs to be a participant in solving. But now that we're here in Europe and we're focused on Europe, and you're here and you have a lot of experience with the European community, there's also the hope and then a variety of concerns about the European ecosystem. So if you could just share your perspective, building on what Brian, Chris, and Durhane have shared.
Durhane very eloquently talked about leapfrogging, who's doing well. I think in Europe, actually, we've been leapfrogged in terms of clinical trial development with other parts of the world, and we need to regroup and leapfrog over other regions which are really advancing in those developments. Our hope is really about the unmet needs of the 95% and to see an ecosystem developed in Europe which encourages innovation and rewards innovation. Otherwise, that hope which this technology offers people will be a false promise, and people can't live with that. Really, it's unfair in many ways. Driving greater equity in terms of access and development of these therapies in Europe is really important. And with any form of innovation, it's no one sector or stakeholder is responsible for the development or implementation. So events like this and ARM, give us hope because people come together and build those innovative partnerships and ways to collaborate. I look at what the UK have done with Catapult, and that gives me hope that a health system can go, hey, we can do this, and we can organise the system to be better in reducing the cost of R&D by making manufacturing facilities available to small and medium enterprises, reducing the costs, making the system ready to plug and play for new therapies to be adopted. I mean, that gives me hope that if the UK can do that, let's scale that up across Europe and make sure that Europe can do that. But with lots of rare diseases, the prevalence and the size of diseases means that we have to take a different approach. So actually there's work going on globally which gives us hope in terms of those global partnerships, collaborations, which Durhane knows very well, which I think are the building blocks of maybe building a global ecosystem where you've got HTA bodies and regulators collaborating as well. So innovative partnerships isn't just manufacturing researchers and treatment centres. It should also be along the regulatory pathway.
Yeah. And maybe Matt, and then I'll turn to Brian and Chris. When you look at this overall build out of the European ecosystem, how integral is patient involvement across that? Is that something that you think all of the stakeholders in the ecosystem equally value, some value more than others? Like how, you know, from a purely patient perspective, what can patients and patient advocacy groups to kind of push the envelope and get people to become much more willing to take risk and do these types of innovative partnerships?
I think certainly in the haemophilia space in the last 7 or 8 years, we've become much more involved with EMA and with EDQM and the Council of Europe. And I have to say we found EMA very engaging, very willing to listen, to understand the patient and patient organisation perspective. We work collaboratively with clinicians to make sure that the real patient relevant outcomes are discussed.
Yep.
With the Council of Europe, they've come up with recommendations which have managed to shift the needle in terms of haemophilia care in many European countries, because you now have official Council of Europe recommendations in many areas. So I'm a big believer in working with the institutions and educating them and making sure that our point of view is taken on board. For example, I'll give you an example with gene therapy. The European clinicians and patient organisations are of the collective view that a hub and spoke model is the best way to roll out gene therapy for haemophilia. And that's certainly going to be accepted, I think, by the EMA and by the Council of Europe.
Yeah. Matt?
I think in terms of patient community, EURORDIS have stepped forward in this space a few years ago in terms of bringing people together to have that conversation, to try and grasp the nettle on some of the challenges and sort out solutions. Actually, there's lots of convergence of stuff on the technical side to try and sort out those problems. Mm-hmm. So patient community are leaders and should be leaders in this space to bring the dialogue together. The level of uncertainty around the long-term impacts of these therapies is something which we need to overcome. And really, it's a patient community and you know, the haemophilia community talking about what is the value for them, the meaningful value, and to shine a light in that uncertainty to get some evidence and outcomes which are meaningful and show real value to regulators and HTA bodies to really support the price reimbursement process.
Got it. And Chris?
Yes, I mean, it's a fact that, you know, patients need information, and they need information that is transparent and unbiased. And also they need information about the way selection happens, because usually patients do not, well, first of all, they are not proactive, the majority of them at least, in terms of going and demanding from a clinician. And they don't necessarily know how the system works in terms of clinical trials and how to promote you know, themselves as a potential recruitment person. So this area tends to be a little bit opaque and needs to be kind of brought out into the open. The information and the education and the raising of awareness that has to happen is a matter of basically patient organizations and for all of us. And the question is, what is the best way to do it? Who is the best person and entity to create educational material, information, guidelines, etc., yeah, which is aimed at patients, because it's going to be in a simple language, even though they are complex concepts, compared to, you know, clinical guidelines or management guidelines, which are clinicians and scientists talking to each other. So we need to be able to do that in order to support the decision-making of patients And bearing in mind always that this decision-making relies on a number of nuances and a number of factors which are cultural, religious, have to do with the belief system of not only the patient, the carers, the family, as well as the societal environment within which they live.
Durhane, anything to add?
Well, I mean, I really love kind of where that conversation's come, right? But I think as you're hearing is that a patient is not a patient is not a patient. And I think it's really important to understand. There are patients that are needing to make decisions about gene therapy or not gene therapy, going into clinical trials or not clinical trials, and it's getting the education there for people to be able to make a good decision. The same as you recognize that even if they're talking to their clinician may be unevenly informed about the advantages or the disadvantages or even prejudice around some of it. And I think that's important as well. So as Chris saying, getting that information through the patient organizations to the patients is important. The other thing is that patient organizations actually do know the people. I mean, I was at a meeting last year hosted by Faster Cures through the Millikan Institute, and I was never more surprised to hear some of the feedback from the patient organizations as to why their patients would not actually accept the gene therapy. They don't trust it. They don't understand the science behind it. They don't understand or trust the companies and even the regulators that have approved this because they have not been part of that dialogue and because they see this. It's sort of like the vaccine story all over again, right? So if you haven't engaged people, you haven't got, trusted, intermediaries that are educating it. So it's not just the information, it's who's the trusted intermediary. And in many cases, it can be the patient organizations and empower them to do that. So even within a very educated and a very well-resourced community, there are huge levels of acceptance, of trust, et cetera. My biggest fear, quite frankly, within a developed community is that there can be a backlash. There can be, we saw that. Nobody saw what was coming with vaccines. All of a sudden, we have this great vaccine, everybody's anticipated, and then get this big backlash that says anti-vaccines. Like, where the hell did that come from? And my biggest fear is that we will get some of this, or if there's going to be an incident. Brian, you will know way back when we had the one incident with a child dying, during those early, gene therapy trials. Trials stopped for many years because we weren't anticipating it. So that's some of the things I think we need to think about. It's not just education, but as I think Matt talked about, understanding the culture, understanding the religion, understanding some of the other kinds of issues that we have to deal with. But I think, just very quickly, I don't want to overdo it, but Matt knows where I'm going to go globally. I think we have to recognize is that there are many patients there who don't have. We support patient engagement because we believe in developed environments, EMA, FDA, even in some of the more advanced Japan, Korea, because patients have a voice, patients can be influential. In many low middle income countries developing, patients are not influential. Patients do not have a voice. Even in Latin America, in many cases, they don't have that same kind of voice to be able to compel action. So there isn't investment in the patients, and it becomes, unfortunately, one of those lose-lose situations where, because patients aren't necessarily seen as influential, there's not the investment in doing the education, raising them to the level of the expert patients that we may have in the more developed environments. The good news, I think, is that patients know how to get together with each other. You have the World Federation, you have, Thalassemia International, you have even RDI or some of the regional alliances where patients are directly connecting and they're actually able to become experts because they're connecting with others. Now our goal is to be able to get them to be able to be more involved with the companies in some of these developing regions to actually be able to be part of the clinical trials and helping to position these therapies to actually be brought into country. If we don't do the clinical trials there, we don't get the expertise there, we don't raise the profile of them, and then we'll never get them available. And I think companies, we really feel need to think about, and I will go to where the end of this I'm going to say is, we would love to have companies think about the world as your market. not the developed world, and then we'll get to the developing world. The world right now is your market. Now what are you going to do about it?
Yeah.
Can I make a point?
Yep,
That,
yep.
that I think we're not sitting back as patient organisations and waiting for a wave of innovation to roll over and see what happens. We're being thoughtful and proactive in our engagement, not just with EMA and FDA and the regulators in terms of things like the core outcomes they should be looking at, but also with the payers, with the HTA agencies. I'll give you a couple of quick examples. We had a forum with gene therapy companies, with scientists, clinicians and regulators and payers, where we outlined what we felt were the key outcomes to look at in terms of gene therapy clinical trials for haemophilia, not just the standard bleed rate that they always looked at. We wanted to be a bit more thoughtful about that. And then with the payers, we've come up with a value framework. We've published some papers on alternative payment models. We've published some papers on how to relook at HTAs in terms of gene therapies. So I think it's not just waiting and seeing what happens. It's trying to influence and be involved in what happens. That's really important.
Yeah, Brian, and obviously, you know we're a sponsor of 2 hemophilia gene therapy programs, and I think the hemophilia community is maybe one of the bright lights in terms of how advanced and how involved the patient communities and patients themselves have been. And I'm wondering if you're thinking that that could be a good model to apply to other disease states, maybe not the ones that have essentially no treatment options, but maybe the ones where there are some treatments that are available, but maybe not optimal. Do you think that we could leverage the success with the hemophilia programs into some of these other disease states?
Well, I think one of the reasons for the key level of interest in the haemophilia community is the tragic history in the past with HIV and hepatitis, and so many people died as a result of unsafe treatment, so there was an obsession with getting safe and effective treatment. Having said that, I think the community is very engaged in education and shared decision-making, in informed decision-making, and also in looking at the complex network of therapeutic options and where ATMPs fit in with that. And I think that the way that we approach this with education, with engagement, could be looked at by other conditions. But obviously I'm fully aware that for many other conditions, when I've talked to people from other organizations where they look at gene therapies, there may be one gene therapy for the condition in clinical trials, where with haemophilia there are multiple gene therapy clinical trials. And I think also in many other conditions, you have no other therapeutic option. Gene therapy might be your only hope. And also, if gene therapy for haemophilia is in adults, from age 18. Yeah. So by the time you can first start considering it, you have 18 years experience with the disease. Your parents have 18 years experience. If your child's got SMA, you don't have that time or experience. So I think we have to differentiate between the conditions from that point of view. That the risk-benefit ratio is different and the therapeutic options are different. But certainly I think we would be convinced that shared decision-making is a really good way to go for any therapeutic option. But for gene therapy, certainly for haemophilia, our view is that shared decision-making must be mandatory between the clinician and the patient. Yeah. We want people going in, managing and setting their expectations properly.
And Brian, maybe just one additional question. Durhane raised the issue of trust and distrust in different aspects of the healthcare system and therapeutics for patient communities. Obviously, in the haemophilia community, that level of distrust was kind of destroyed in buckets, but trust is kind of earned drip by drip. And I'm just curious if in the hemophilia community, where you've had these tragic episodes in the past, but now we're kind of past that, is that also a potentially good model where we have trust issues in different patient communities about, and in particular in ATMPs, and are there ways that we could leverage the experience with hemophilia to also bridge that trust gap where we have it in other disease states, and particularly in the modalities of ATMPs?
I think it's a question of giving not just comprehensive, but comprehensible information to patients, having trusted interlocutors giving that information. So we would typically, when we were looking at gene therapy clinical trials, for example, we would have had the gene therapy companies, but also the key clinicians whom the patients knew and trusted, and the patient organization speaking about this. So it's not just the information you're giving, it's who's giving the information, how closely you collaborate together, and making sure that the information is given to people at a level that they can understand and comprehend. Because gene therapy has its own lexicon and language. And frankly, I've been in audiences where somebody starts to talk in gene therapy and 10 minutes in, they've lost the audience because they've just switched off because they're using
I
so
might have
many
made one
words.
of those presentations.
Yeah, so it's a question of, getting key clinicians, patient leaders, gene therapy companies explaining what the therapy is, what it's not, and also with therapy like gene therapy, where there are so many unknowns. And, unlike many other therapies, you can't say, right, if we give you this, this is going to be your outcome. And if that doesn't work, we'll top you up, we'll give it to you more often. You can't do that. It's an irreversible one-off therapy. So it's a big, big decision. And I think we would view the fact that that decision has to be taken very cautiously, very clearly by the patient, but they must be fully involved in the discussion with the clinician, with the patient organisation, with the gene therapy company.
Correct.
And that's how you build trust, is that dialogue.
Yeah. Christos, anything to add there?
Well, I think in all of this, I think the patient expert is key to have the person that is trusted, trustworthy, and will be a kind of filter in all that discourse. Because what I have experienced is that it doesn't matter how many conferences you organize, how many clinicians, top people being invited to give their opinion, etc., etc. At the end of the day, when everybody's gone home, the patient will come to you because they know you. And they will ask you, so what do you think? So is it a good thing? I remember, this happening all the time, not only in gene therapy and ATMPs when I was at EMA, but also at the same time in other areas of standard of care treatment, when we were having different issues and we were trying to smooth them over. Also, to be able to interact and influence areas of policy making, such as even management guidelines, which we had a number of to do. And the patient organization needs people that are patient experts, who understand the science, who understand the clinical facts, and who can go one-to-one, even with clinicians if needs be, to say, but why are you doing this that way? What about this? What about that? And to be able to have a proper argument. And I think clinicians accept that, expect that, and appreciate it to some extent. So I think this can be translated to the discourse about ATMPs and about the decision making. And if we also have patient experts who are embedded in the clinical development as independent influencers and observers, and trying to convey to the sponsor right from the beginning of the conception of the clinical development what constitutes value, what constitutes valuable endpoints for patients, clinically meaningful, what constitutes the amount of relevance and the evidence that will be required, and what amount of evidence will be feasible, because of course you can be asked to provide all sorts of data, especially now data is very valuable. And we heard, that the good companies have a lot of data, and these are the companies that get funded with good data. But then what is meaningful data? And then to have that happen, because that will be beneficial not only to the patients ultimately, but it will be beneficial to the sponsor, it will be beneficial throughout the clinical development, the design of the clinical development program, also downstream regulatory approval, and most importantly, price and reimbursement. That is where the main problem and the main bottleneck is. And that's where we need to change.
Well, that's going to be...
But that's the next step.
I think that's the message you want to deliver to the next panel on the HTA. So that was one of the reasons I wanted to tee up that question as kind of set up Nicholas's
sorry, I
next
made the bridge for you.
But Durhane, I know you're itching to say something, so please.
No, I just really love to kind of where this discussion is going, and certainly what Brian and Chris have said. We are getting to the point of trying to kind of figure out how do we make it more broadly accessible. And yes, price is one of the factors. I think it's exciting to see some of the innovative financing schemes that have come forth, a bit different than some of the financing schemes for other innovative therapies where there's really not very much, where it's a continuous therapy so that one can talk about, okay, we can do outcomes-based assessments and we can measure whether or not they're meeting the milestones, or there's lack of clarity in terms of which patients might actually ultimately benefit. You've got patients with range of disease severity or at different ages. SMA's been one of the big examples. It works well in children. Does it work well in adults? Pompe is the same thing. But with gene therapies, it's a little bit different, right? Because it's in theory, a one-time application. So, you can't take it away. You can't stop it. But, what do you do then in order to continue to assure that if we've got a payment model that you're going to be paying, in a way that actually makes sense over the lifetime of the treatment? So I think a lot of it is, and I'm looking forward to your next panel, because some of the challenges really are kind of how do we actually make this so that it's going to be affordable, it's going to be accessible, but beyond that, what is it that we're going to be measuring in terms of demonstrating that it does have this kind of a lifetime, value to it. I mean, in hemophilia, we've already got some of the issues coming back is the factor level may drop over time. And, the good news in some respects is that you don't need to be at, 100% in order to actually get the benefits of it. But what does that mean for other diseases? We don't know, If that gene therapy does not continue to perform at the same level in SMA, what are we going to expect? We don't know because we've never had kids that have lived beyond that. We don't even know what it's like for an adult with SMA without treatment, let alone what it's like for them with treatment. So I think these are very challenging times for certainly payers to go into and kind of saying, okay, where do I get the most for my money in order to make sure that, we're going to deliver on it. So I think there's a lot of, I think as you're saying, need to be working with the full community. So certainly with the developers, certainly with the regulators, certainly with the HTA people, certainly with the payers, most of all with the patients in terms of what do we do to assure that we're going to get those outcomes. And I think that's, it's an interesting challenge. I think the other thing that, comes up is we're getting, SMA is a good example, where we've got newborns. They're now coming in and getting immediate access to treatment. Parents with these children, I mean, some of them that are just recognizing, and they're part of communities where they can see the other kids that have not had access to treatment. They can see the benefits of it, but what about that next generation that's coming through who are not going to know the difference? I mean, we're already seeing in things like MPS, where the kids have actually had good access to, replacement therapies. They don't actually know what it's like not to. And I've got teenagers now and young adults who are saying, I don't want to take my treatment anymore because I don't know what it's like not to have treatment. And parents are going crazy because they know what it's like for kids not to be on treatment. I think we've got a lot of these kind of developmental issues that are going to come up, and I think the question's been asked with hemophilia as well, and that is, how are you going to get them to keep coming back in order to demonstrate the value of the outcomes if they're living free lives? Do they still want to come in for regular assessments? Can you compel them to come in? And you can't take away anything from them because they're already treated. So I think we've got a lot of great, social, psychological kinds of issues that we need to address along the way in order for us not to lose, I think, what we're gaining in terms of gene therapies. The things that are going to hurt us may be those unanticipated things that have nothing to do with the science, that may have nothing to do with the actual benefits of it.
Yeah. I mean, certainly a variety of interrelated and complex issues that we all need to sort through. Matt, I know that you've been looking at some of the ways that the healthcare system can evolve to potentially address and mitigate some of these concerns and complexities. Maybe you could just share a little bit of the work that you and your team at EURORDIS have been doing.
So that whole process of demonstrating, value over a longer period, you need a system in place, an infrastructure in place to collect that data, to be clear on who's doing that, who's responsible for that in a consistent way. And at the moment, that's not the reality we live in. The nearest centre to get access to treatment generally is probably another country. The availability of those treatments in my home country might not be there. So we have to look, sort of have a helicopter view on a bigger population size and organise ourselves quite differently. having the research and treatment centres collaborating more actively so you can build that infrastructure and invest in that infrastructure which can collect the real-world evidence which we need to show value and to support this shift in payment models to innovative financing and instead of the one-time payments. We're not seeing that shift happen regularly. It's just not, people don't trust it yet, that we can make the changes to the system, the processes to be able to move to a different model. I think in terms of on a European level, there was a recent call to develop an ecosystem for advanced therapies, and for me that was very positive, to bring together those researchers, manufacturing facilities working together with manufacturers, and I think that starts to lay the foundation of something which is workable in Europe. What we get is, with the European reference networks, we've got access to specialist advice, where advice follows, travels to the patient locally, instead of the patient having to go to see the physician or surgeon. But what we don't have is where we, on a European level, treatment centres for a European population. Those lighthouses for those ultra-rare conditions where, Milan acts in that way for some of the therapies, and they hit massive barriers in terms of supporting people to come from Sweden or other countries for accessing the treatment they need in a very short window of time. So we need to develop the health systems to be able to be fit for purpose, but we also need to build the pathways to access those treatment centres for a European population. Otherwise, you can be in a neighbouring country and hope is just next door, and you can't access it. And on a European level, we definitely can't accept that. And on a global level, we need to start having that conversation of how we can develop a global infrastructure and ecosystem.
Yeah, and I think some of the potential solution sets, especially with the IHI call from December, I think there's probably an initiative that will soon be started, hopefully in the second half of this year, that will help address some of these European-specific aspects. But I'm just kind of curious, when the four of you think about ARM and ARM's role in convening the community, having meetings like this here on the Med, and the role that we're kind of leading in terms of shaping policy, I'm interested to get your thoughts. And I know some of you are more familiar with ARM and its mission and its accomplishments to date, but when you think about an organization in a community like this, and you look at it from each of your four unique perspectives, what advice would you give Tim as our new CEO, myself as a board member, the collective membership of ARM? What could we do better to help advance some of these hope and concern issues that you raised?
I think you could have a dialogue with patient organizations, make sure you understand what's important to the patients. I'm sure when Volkswagen are coming up with a new concept car, they talk to some people who actually buy cars and drive cars. So if you're going to develop an ATMP, first of all, is that something, you've got a concept for an ATMP, is that something the community wants and needs? Is it filling an unmet need? Is it exciting? And then looking at clinical trials, the protocol itself, how that's laid out, how practical it is, look at the readability of the clinical trial protocol. And then perhaps ARM could have a role in producing general education materials on therapies like gene therapy. I'm not talking about disease specific, I'm talking about general education materials, what gene therapy is, what it is not, how AAV works, and so on and so forth, how lentivirus works. And I think that there is a gap there where that has not been produced. And before you start talking about specific gene therapies for a condition, patients need exposure to general gene therapy concept and what it is as a therapy. So I think that level of engagement, and then on an ongoing basis, even talking about outcomes, talking about this feeds into regulation, this feeds into reimbursement, because I think your chief executive yesterday mentioned in the open talk about the fact that it's hard to persuade a payer to go beyond 3 to 5 years with a therapy that might last 25. Yet if it's with in a dialogue with a patient organisation, I think you can quickly see that there is an understanding of the need for ongoing monitoring and looking at the monitoring that's required, and that's practical and reasonable, and not too burdensome, but yet will give everybody the data that they require is really, really important. I think, in a sense, when we're talking to people with haemophilia about gene therapy, we stress the importance of the ongoing long-term monitoring.
Yeah.
In fact, in the community, when there was talk about should it be a 5-year follow-up or a 15-year follow-up, many people felt it should be lifetime follow-up. Because in any case, we're used to lifetime follow-up at the moment, so why would you change that?
Yeah.
So I think dialogue on all those levels can actually add value and richness to the ongoing work.
And Brian, do you think, some of these concerns, particularly about something like if we had a universal pan-ATMP long-term follow-up protocol with, a defined set of elements that every study would incorporate with unique add-ins or subtractions based upon the modality and the therapeutic benefit and maybe the safety exposure. It seems to me like some effort in terms of standardization would help eliminate some of the friction and a lot of the kind of infrastructure costs that every individual therapeutic developer is bearing on its own. Whereas if we could share things and do it in a more open and transparent and pre-competitive way, would that be another way to solve, some of these issues? And could ARM play a role in advancing those types of discussions?
I agree. You could have almost a core data set that you would collect for gene therapy
Exactly.
for any condition, and then you add to that for various other outcomes that you look at for various different conditions. We're already doing that with haemophilia, there's very well advanced work on a global gene therapy registry. In fact, I was on a call yesterday with the EMA about this, and they're getting the regulators involved, and they are collaborating with existing national registries and not duplicating, but there will be ideally a global registry, and that is built around a core data set. Now, countries may collect more data than that, but at least you have the core from every country, and that allows you to get a really global sense of what's happening.
Yeah.
I think a core data set for any gene therapy could be developed, and then you add to that for various conditions.
I know we're going to be running short on time here quick, but I want to just give also Chris and Durhane and Matt an opportunity to share their thoughts on what ARM could do to help.
Do you want to go?
You can go.
Well, the fact is this. Gene therapies are transformative therapies. And in order for gene therapies to transform patients' lives, you need two things. You need good science and good policy. Your members are taking care of the good science, and thankfully the science is improving, the products are maturing, and we're getting the good science to deliver the desired outcome for patients. The problem is in the policy. The policy at the level of national payers and the policy at the level of the willingness to pay for highly innovative but fairly expensive therapies. The question is, what can ARM do in terms of developing and changing that policy so that the willingness to pay improves and patients can be treated, and there are more and more patients can be treated, because at best, unless you are a very, very severe disease with a high infant mortality like SMA, Adder-Skid, etc., the chances that you will be funded for a very good, efficacious therapy are very low. I mean, what we've seen so far, at least, seems to suggest that, and the numbers are going to be very, very small. And patients want to be treated. Patients are asking when this will be available for me, and what can I do in order to, qualify. And this is in the developed world. If we're talking about the developing world, then it's another question altogether. There's not even any discussion about that at the moment. So ARM has to develop its policy so that the lobbying and governments and with patient organizations together, they are able to change that and to kind of democratize. And also there's an issue about equity, because the way things are at the moment, we have a system where one patient fights another patient to get access, and that's within the same disease, let alone across diseases.
Yeah.
Which disease gets, a bigger share of the pie?
Yeah.
And I think that is a major issue that we are having to face and resolve. And there's a second part of policy, which is the policy about the clinical development, particularly in the areas of manufacturing and quality. And this is extremely important because we have developed a set of scientific research tools which have got us to this way now. And now that the technology has matured and is maturing in many areas, we need to rethink the process of developing delivery systems in particular. And we need to find ways to design in cost effectiveness right from the beginning, right from the starting materials, so that in terms of manufacturing, A, we avoid the bottlenecks, and B, we are able to reduce the price because that component, which just adds cost, a lot of cost, has a very detrimental impact on patients.
Well, very, very constructive feedback. Thanks, Christos. Durhane?
So let me extend the challenge. I agree with certainly what Brian and Chris have said, and a lot of it much more than I had thought about before. But let me extend the challenge, and that is, do we need 10 gene therapies for hemophilia? Do we need 10 gene therapies for thalassemia? What we're hearing from patients is, what about the other diseases? Are the incentive models there in order for us to start to address the lesser known rare diseases? Or, as Chris and Brian are talking about, diseases for which there are no current treatments, against which, when we do HTA, the comparators are just crap, because you don't come up with any kind of cost effectiveness. I can actually have a very expensive therapy for hemophilia because the cost of treating hemophilia is fairly high because most patients get access to it, or thalassemia. The model that says, and you know this well, if we look at gene therapy for muscular dystrophy, the cost effectiveness is very, very low because I don't have anything effective against it except for supportive care and other kinds of devices. Yeah. But what about other rare diseases? I know we're talking about things like bespoke gene therapy models, we're talking about ultra-rare diseases, but there's also that whole gap in between those other diseases for which we should be. And actually, many of the lysosomal storage diseases, the gene therapy on them has stopped because there isn't the bulk of patients, there isn't the strong patient advocacy, there isn't the ability to get them to market in a way that's going to be cost-effective against the kinds of, kind of cost-effective, assessments that are there now. So I would go back to Armin said, are you really an alliance? Or are you just kind of competitors that are kind of sitting together? Are you able to say we can work as an alliance of companies, of researchers that are developing gene therapies and begin to think about the big landscape? We don't all need to go to where the light is in terms of those therapies and those diseases that already have created markets, that have already created the opportunity to come in. What about all the other diseases? Can we do more for them? And it's not to blame any company, because you go to where the models are set up in order to get the support for the research and the support for the development and the support for the reimbursement. So I won't say just you as an alliance, can we, as part of your alliance, help to create different kinds of models that would also incentivize? And I love what's happening, what you folks are doing with the bespoke therapies. We had a patient in Canada who raised $4 million to get a gene therapy for his son and got it developed in the hospital. And as he was developing, it says, can you not make one? Can you make 5? Because I know 5 other families that need it. And he's giving that therapy to the other 5 families. But that's not a model for sustainability, but it's a great model. And so somewhere in between there, we need to start thinking about how do we actually provide gene therapy for the masses, gene therapy for those smaller, rare diseases. Yeah. So, I would say that for ARM, as an alliance, and maybe we as part of kind of helping to support and being part of that alliance need to think about not only lesser developed countries, not only poorer countries, but also those other diseases that are not yet there on the front lines.
Well, Durhane, thanks for laying down that challenge for ARM and the collective.
Well, I see Tim over there, and I know he's taking notes like crazy.
His long list of challenges is getting longer. Matt, maybe if you could share your thoughts, and then we'll just
I'll be quick. So
leave a few minutes for questions from the floor.
I think there's three things which ARM can do, really. With the new developments of gene therapies for those 95%, you know, there are small and medium enterprises which are leading on that activity and that research. So maybe ARM can bring together and saying, you know, bringing the patient representatives earlier in the process, in the development process, and set that out, set some standards and saying, you know, what good looks like, drawing on the knowledge and experience you've got to date. I think that would be a first step. The second step is ARM to be maybe a go-to reference hub for information, for trusted information for the patient community, for the public, to be able to make more equitable access to the information which is available. And third is really to think globally. With ultra-rare diseases, we need to think globally. We need to build a global ecosystem, and there's interest from the FDA and EMA about collaborating on a global level. So ARM step forward and show some leadership and start to bring those stakeholders together and saying, you know, what does this look like?
Mm-hmm. Excellent points. Well, thank you all for sharing those. We have roughly 5 minutes. If there's any members of the audience here that would like to ask a question to our panelists, we're welcome to take them. We need one brave volunteer to get the dialogue started. Well, maybe while everyone is contemplating their question, I will ask one more. On this issue of globalization and making global access, is there a model in other industries or other areas of society where you think this has been done well? I know that my own experience with Pfizer, with the COVID vaccine and COVID therapeutics, we feel like we've maybe put a little bit of a spearhead effort into, at least in the therapeutic medicinal area, that getting access to less developed countries, but it's a significant challenge. But I'm just curious your thoughts of, you know, are there other ways that we could do this that could be creative solutions by just leveraging the experience across other industries? And, you know, I just kind of think about it myself. If you think about an iPhone versus landlines, as an example, in the communications industry has been, you know, an evolutionary development for less developed countries, but are there other things that we can think of?
Well, hepatitis C would be one example. The direct-acting antivirals, when they came on the market, were extremely expensive with some, but there was sort of a different deal made for countries like Egypt and India where it was affordable. Exactly. And now the prices have come way, way down for those therapies in every country. Gene therapy, is difficult to see it following the same model because of the cost of goods and the actual cost of producing the gene therapy, but there must be some way of looking at that over the medium term. And I hear Durhane's point earlier about lack of access for other conditions, lack of access for low and medium income countries. I take a slightly different view, I think. I think it'll take several years, certainly in the hemophilia space, for gene therapy to become part of the mainstream as a therapeutic option, and then you start looking at how to get it to low and medium income countries. And I think there are also countries like India and China who are currently doing their own gene therapy clinical trials, and certainly that may be more affordable for them in India to use a vector they produce themselves. But I think it has to be consciously thought of. I know one company in the hemophilia space who are currently carrying out phase 3 clinical trials, and they're including several low and medium income countries in the trials. And I think that's a helpful development.
Yeah.
Wind technology. I mean, it's a different kind of technology, but you know, when you think about it, right? Actually, wind technology, I mean, who's the country that actually has the most wind technology right now, and it's actually in China. You know, so we think about, you know, how do we develop, you know, kind of, as Brian's saying, create resources within the local environment in order to take a bigger role in terms of the development and manufacture, and maybe using, you know, some more of the local technology, using more of the local knowledge. And, you know, we think of gene, you know, therapy, I think, as being this highly, highly complex science that's way over here and only very few people. But there are ways, as you say, that we can do that in much different ways. I mean, certainly even in Canada, we're looking at academic centers that are coming in and saying, can we have vector platforms where we can actually produce, many more kinds of gene therapies using the same platform? And maybe it's not. It's what you're saying in terms of having low costs, not only resource goods, but also involving people at that local level. So you're not developing necessarily new gene therapies, but you're able to develop those gene therapies there. So I think if we look at some of the climate change innovations that we can see where solar panels, wind technology, some of those are actually quite accessible in lower income countries and maybe done in a way that's even cheaper than we would do it elsewhere.
Yeah, great points. I'm just a little bit blinded by the light. I see one hand up in the audience.
Two.
You got one here?
There.
Oh.
My name is Trisha Bolz. I work as an advisor to ARM and also a number of cell and gene therapy companies. I've worked one in myself. Just a question on patient engagement. We talked about the patient expert voice. Brian, you talked about working with regulators, EMA, collaboratively. Christos, you talked about the role of ARM in policy. I just have a question. I know the patient engagement in the regulatory field, especially in Europe with EMA, is very well established. Do you feel, perhaps beyond the official patient engagement and HTA process, there is a greater role for the patient community and patient expert voices to bring the patient perspective across with policymakers and with payers? Do you feel that's happening enough today beyond what ARM members, other groups are doing? Any thoughts on that?
Well, there's always room for improvement, and we need as many collaborators as possible, and the Alliance could possibly be one of them, and why not? Because that is a prime target for improving lives of patients. Indeed, I think there is a very strange dynamic tension, perhaps I would call it, between patient engagement and HTA as well as payers. And it's always the patients are involved, but they are involved in a kind of very controlled way. And the structure is very well defined and effectively it's of a very limited scope. So it's not as widespread as it would be with EMA, where you have patient representation at all levels, including inside the committees, although I don't know what's going to happen now with the new draft legislation, and whether that will be maintained or will be diluted in some way. I'm very concerned about that. But I mean, when it comes to HTAs and agencies and payers, then we need to improve. We need transparency. And in my country, I guess it is better than elsewhere. But again, that doesn't necessarily mean that it cannot be improved.
Can I just add to that, that I have the impression that in some countries, patient involvement in HTA is a box-ticking exercise. Yeah. They're able to say, okay, we have involved the patients, we've solved submission. There was a recent almost HTA carried out by ICER in the USA on several haemophilia therapies. And I have to say I was very impressed by the open, transparent way that they involved the patient organisation at several stages, including before it started, looking at the scoping, looking at every aspect of it, having patient experts involved and engaged, and open public hearings. And I think it's a model that could be followed. I'm not sure the economics in the USA are a model that should be followed, but certainly the process they followed was real patient engagement, and I very much enjoyed that.
Yeah, but the difference, Brian, is that the HTA agency in the US has no real impact. Most of our HTA agencies, including Canada, including most of the countries in Europe, they're actually directly influencing the decisions that the payers make. In the US, they can afford. It's like the regulators, like we were talking about. Regulators can bring in as many patient engagement as they want. They can listen to all the patient opinions, because at the end of the day, their decisions are not going to be directly impacting on terms of the reimbursement. So the challenge, I mean, I love kind of what the US does and how their process works, but unfortunately, when you've got countries that are, as you say, are very narrowly focused in terms of yes or no in terms of payment, then the HTA process with the patient engagement tends to be much more of a pro forma than it is really listening to what the patients say.
Well, thank you for that question. I know we've hit time, but Matt, we'll give you an opportunity to respond, and then we'll wrap up.
So just to say, I think the framework is about to be set up in terms of the new IHI initiative that will give a framework to have patient representatives pushing a dialogue around policy at a national level and European level, and bring innovation, get policy to lead the innovation development as opposed to the other way around. So I think we've got a new framework which hopefully will come in and provide that framework which will be optimal to ensure this takes place.
Well, thank you. I just want to give a very sincere thank you to our panelists, Durhane, Chris, Brian, and Matt, for sharing their experiences, their insights, and hopefully this was valuable to the audience as we think through how to evolve ARM and include more patients in our ecosystem and to advance all of your collective interest. And Durhane, thanks for laying out the very ambitious challenges for us going forward. Very much appreciated. And as Matt said yesterday in his opening comments, we're really here to learn and to share our ideas in an open and transparent way, and I very much thank you for doing that. So please, everyone, give them a nice round of applause.
And certainly thanks to you for not only the invitation, but to everybody for paying attention.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for the kind words.
Okay.